Howdy, folks. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. It's a Friday. I know everyone literally doesn't want to use their brain today. Include me in that camp. But we're going to have a great time today. We've got our special guest. On this side. Okay, I got it. I got the arrow finger pointing in the right direction. Lucas Morgan, how are you, my friend?
What's up? Good. How are you?
Good, man. Good. So, for folks that don't know Lucas, you've been around the scene for a long time. You've done a lot of big projects. You've created some really amazing tools, and we're going to dive into all those today. So, everyone in the chat, if you're on YouTube, if you're on Twitch, I see you. Hi, everyone. Let's get the chat active. It's not often that we have... actually, I guess we do have guests. But listen. We don't have the same guests come on often. So, get your questions in, get your comments in. Let's make this a fun, interactive session. We love having a conversation with ye old chat. So with that said, I see, and there's someone posted, that's a great emoji. There's like a dog emoji on Twitch. That's what I feel like every day. That's what I'm talking about. So with that said, Lucas, welcome. Do you want to tell folks a little bit about your background, how you got into our industry? Because I know everyone's story has kind of a similar shape where it's like, it almost feels like one of those choose your own adventure books. And we just randomly flip through the pages and end up here. But it's always interesting to hear what those choices were along the way.
Yeah, well, I'll start with something I've learned now about that whole choose your own adventure process. I think is interesting, and maybe a lot of people can relate to. But you look back through the choices you make that seem kind of random, and there's usually a pattern. And learning what that pattern is gives you some insight into what it is that you are naturally drawn to. And so, anyways,
that's wise words. That's wise words right there.
Yeah, well, I think it's true, and I think it becomes more obvious as time goes on, especially if you run into a lot of different areas in terms of fields and stuff like that. Where I started off was the opposite of TouchDesigner in terms of the real-time nature, because the first job I had out of college was a game design job, but it was actually doing the art, and the art was not real time. People think of games and you're like, okay, you're doing Unreal or Unity or something like that, but actually the studio that I got hired onto, again, this was just hey, what company's hiring? Oh, this one that's in Dallas next to where I live. Cool. But they were doing kind of a different style of game where you have these really detailed pictures, more of a casual game you play on a tablet or something like that. And so what I ended up doing was these scenes, these environments, like trees, nature, sometimes city stuff, that would take hours to render, literally hours from Maya. And so I was just creating these environments, these textures, and that was fun, and I enjoyed that for a long time. But at some point, I transitioned from that into the real-time world because of TouchDesigner and a show I saw, Amon Tobin's ISM, which I think a lot of people like.
I think for our generation of touch developers, that and Plastic Man were oh, we're going to get into this industry. This one is sick. Let's do it.
Yeah, I tell people that story, and everyone's just they smile and they're like, oh yeah, I know. That was the case for me.
And the funny thing is, when you say that, so many people were there at one of the shows. I bet if I was raise your hand in the chat if you were at the first Amon Tobin at Mutech, I'm sure somebody's gonna be like, oh yeah, I was there, and I was in the front and I was in the back. Or
it was a Coachella showing for me, and then I ended up coming to Dallas 1 year later. I brought a couple of friends who aren't even in my industry, and they just had a blast. They still talk about it. They still bring it up because it sticks with you. Yeah, it's
one of my favorite shows I think I've seen ever.
It's just a different way of experiencing a live event too. I think that was maybe new as well. But I have a few things I could show, just some OG.
Oh yeah, let's do it. You want me to go to the screen share?
Yeah, that works.
And so before you dive into that, just a quick question, because I know we're going to keep going forward in time. So in school, did you study 3D art or digital art of some sort?
Yeah, I went to Full Sail. Full Sail is all about computer animation.
Oh, that's cool.
And various tech art, but technically driven art stuff. So yeah, it really was very much I was learning how to use Maya, Photoshop, putting them together, character sculpting, animation, all those things that you would learn in a film kind of oriented degree. So VFX for film, that was kind of the background I had.
Oh, that's awesome. That must have been such a strong base to have under your kind of like wings when you're getting into this.
Yeah, and when I tell people I'm a software developer now, they're like, oh, that doesn't sound anything like what you did before. But it actually, and this will become obvious in a moment, but there's so much overlap, and it wasn't random. I discovered as time went on. But yeah, here's just a few things I worked on from this game called Dara back in the day, and this was.
Yo, look at that. That's sick. That looks like a sick game.
Yeah, it's like a very it's fantasy oriented. So lots of fantastical environments. But what's fun about this, and the reason why I thought I'd show a couple of these, is because Maya has this thing called paint effects in it, which is basically a super cool generative. It's designed to make like particle systems and plants and different kinds of vegetation, and so all of these plants in here are basically generative. I didn't actually model them by hand. The trees as well. It generates you a mesh, and then you lay out the UVs, you texture it. And so that kind of stuff was where I was naturally drawn to. No surprise.
And that's right? Kind of in that almost like Houdini asset mindset,
yes,
right?
It very much is.
But this would have been like way before, I think. Because Houdini assets is a newer thing, isn't it?
I'm not sure. Houdini is not something I've kept up with or really been too versed in. But yeah, it's probably similar. Same with the grass, right? The grass is something that I approached all these things from like a technical problem solving perspective, not I want to paint things, because I've never been that kind of an artist. Give me a blank canvas and I have no idea what to do with that. So, but yeah, so just this stuff, it's lots of nature, but the thing that I enjoyed most about this, the things that I enjoyed most about this was the lighting, right? I enjoyed seeing the interplay of light on these different structures, whether it be organic or like architectural, and that stuck, right? That was the thing that carried through past this. So a few things that came kind of after that.
So you're also getting a lot of love in the chat. Everyone's saying,
awesome,
way nicer, looks like Mist. Wow, nice use of generative world building. Very cool. Nice. Just do the people. I mean, so everyone's loving it. Everyone's loving it, man.
That's
if
cool.
you ever wanted to go back, you got the thumbs up of approval.
Awesome. Well, yeah, so that's kind of where things began for me. And as that was still going, this was literally the first thing I did with LEDs. First. This was back in 2013.
That's amazing.
Right. It's just like 3 diodes are not even like addressable pixels. They're literally just the 4 pin. And just basically Arduino, just terribly simple stuff. But you got to start there. That's just where everyone starts with LEDs. And things kind of progressed. I put together this hacky sack that had some piezo Knox sensors, and so you kicked it around.
That's cool.
It would react. It's kind of hard to tell in this video, but so that was something. I was super into festivals for a while, and that was a big inspiration. So, doing EL wire stuff, it's just necessary. You got to go through that phase.
I've always looked at the EL wire, and I'm like, I don't know if
I didn't stay there long. I did a couple things with that.
Oh, no, that's sick.
Oh, yeah, that's sure. I'm trying not to delay this too long. And then my, first foray into addressable pixels was with the Adafruit NeoPixel 8x8. And the first thing with TouchDesigner I did, I don't know if this audio is coming through. Let me kill that.
The audio's not coming through. Do you want me to try to get it through?
No, that's fine. Cool. I just wanted to keep that from blasting people. So just some basic audio reactive stuff. Gosh, when was this? This was probably a year later.
Clean network, by the way. Can you bring up that network? I say your first networks look very clean.
Well, there was a very small amount going on, but the OG slider. I'm sure we'll talk about UI stuff soon. But that, so anyways, let me jump forwards in time here a little bit. These pixel experiments. This was the first pixel mapping patch I put together in TouchDesigner. It's just TouchOSC, and it's just rotating this little square, and it's just the slowest transmission speeds you could possibly imagine coming out. You remember that forum post, the bottleneck controlling LEDs? TouchDesigner forum post.
Yeah. Wasn't it specifically 4,000 LEDs or something?
Yeah, something like that.
I even remember the number. Yeah,
it was shortly after this video where I hit that bottleneck, and this was all part of that whole thing. This wasn't GeoPix by name, but this was probably where I would say that it started. I started building out a UI, and this was really for doing my own experiments. But this started growing. Again, this is ancient, right? This is obviously not indicative of anything I would do now.
And they're gonna folks are gonna see how sick GeoPix and UberGUI are pretty soon. But a funny thing I want to add in this, because I was telling you this before we got online, was I really wish I had videos of some of the first projects that I did. And I would say, like, for folks in the chat that are watching, and maybe you can relate to this also, I feel like we go through a phase where we're so disappointed at our early works when we're still at that stage, because our brains are like, oh no man, I want to do Avon Tobin's ISAM, like this looks like
right
garbage. But I can't tell. Keep that stuff, folks. Like,
yeah,
it really becomes like a fun nostalgia thing later in your career. You can look back and remember like where you started. You can show people like, hey, listen, it doesn't start here. Like, it starts with 3 LEDs on a breadboard, and you like build it up. So it's really like awesome just seeing some of those early experiments you had.
Yeah, and to kind of riff off of what you're saying there, one of the things that I think plagues people who constantly push themselves is they never realize how much progress they're making until they step back for a moment and look back. And you have to look back at like a month back, 6 months back, whatever it is, and then you'll be like, oh wow, that's very different from what I'm doing now. And if you recognize that relative difference in your progress, no matter how much you feel like you have left to go, that gives you a boost. And I think that's helpful to think about sometimes. I
think it's amazingly valuable. And I remember for a lot of my beginning of the career, I had that same issue where I was like a hungry mad dog, like just always going forward and never taking time to think like, oh man, like really good work on that project you just did. Like, and I remember there's a very specific example. There's a project in San Francisco we did. It was like a giant LED facade on the outside of a building. I had never even gone to it because I was doing remote dev and to send it in.
Yeah.
And I did, exactly like what you're saying. Finished the project, caring immediately stops, zero retrospective, like, hey, good job, man. Like, and the funny thing was, I went to San Francisco like 4 years later, and I accidentally happened to walk by it, and I was like, oh my god, this is like sick. Why did I not take time to like? God, good work. Like, nice, man. Like, send it back 4 years, the compliments, but I think it's an invaluable thing to think about for folks, especially because those first experiments might not be the flashiest things, but measuring that relative growth is such a good thing for yourselves.
Totally. Yeah, it really does help to like think about that from time to time. Anyways, so things kind of kept escalating as they do. A few more panels, different densities. I kind of took a detour and did this top hat, just crazy amount of LEDs.
Like that. Yeah, that's cool.
And this was all Arduino programming, and so I enjoyed that. But what I discovered with this is that I just felt limited by doing that. I really wanted to be in TouchDesigner doing this stuff.
Oh, so like that hat was like fully Arduino essentially at that.
It was, doing like kind of custom bitmap stuff, and it just the very first thing so that forum post I was mentioning, this is actually the project that I was working on when that happened. I was building a portable LED wall system for a buddy of mine, DJ, uses Tractor. And this is just a video of me setting it up. But yeah, I was just, building these systems. I mean, this is all hot glued onto the back. I mean, this is horribly like beginner stuff. But when you're getting started, that's just like, you don't care so much about building something that's robust. That's kind of always the next step. There he is. Testing it out.
That's great.
He had this, I think it's Tractor, if I remember correctly, but it sends out, you can set up video with your VJ loop or your DJ loops. And so this allowed him to kind of be fully independent of any kind of like lighting control. So
that's awesome.
And then of course I discovered what an infinity mirror was. And then I became obsessed with that. And things kind of again progressed. Let me find another video.
I like how many different areas you went into exploration.
Yeah.
I wasn't the same way in that, like, I kind of just went deeper and deeper into TouchDesigner. I like experiment with random, but it's not like you were like, oh, I'm gonna make a top hat and like infinity mirrors. I like those. I'm gonna get into those. Like, I'm gonna build a portable LED wall.
Yeah, I don't know if I recommend that to everyone. There's ups. It's a mixed bag, because on one hand you learn so much by exposing yourself to all these things, but you also spend time you don't get back, right? And so if you want to end up being like a really good software developer, like, you got to put your time into that. But if you're not sure, and I wasn't really sure what I wanted, I thought maybe I was going to manufacture stuff and sell LED panels. Maybe I was going to do gigs and just do my own shows with my own equipment, and I was going to make that equipment. I didn't really know. I was experimenting with a lot of different things. And if I had just dumped all that into TouchDesigner, I would have gotten further faster. But that's just kind of one of those things that if you do know, you can dump it into one place. This is what I ended up going and doing some gigs with in the very beginning of the gig life stuff, or some infinity mirror panels and some other things.
Oh, so all of those little panels were.
Yeah, so
each one of those panels is a separate infinity mirror panel that you had made.
Yeah, and they're tilted. There's like a 3D printed kind of
big
frame that tilted the back mirror, so it looked like they were curving up or down.
That's awesome.
They were hard as hell to make. I would never make those again. But it was.
You made a lot of them, yeah. I mean, that's like one lifetime's worth of infinity mirror production.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, once you do that once, you want to kind of just make your coffee table or make your whatever and be done with it. Then I started getting into doing installations for music festivals, and I met somebody who did these metal structures from these they would take a 3D file, create a structure out of that, and then they were able to fabricate that. So I worked with him on a few projects, and he ended up building me a structure that I took to Electric Forest one year, and this is pretty close to what it looked like. This was a 3D preview of it. It was called Event Horizon, and where's an actual video of it?
And while you're finding that video, for folks in the chat, feel free to ask Lucas any questions. If you got questions about how maybe he approached some of those background works. We're going to dive into GeoPix and Uber GUI pretty soon. But if you do have questions about kind of Lucas's background and his journey, by all means, throw them in the chat. I'm watching.
Cool. And then yeah, so this was actually the build. Super interesting build. Way the structure went up was interesting. And I know this is not as much of a TouchDesigner related thing, but it was TouchDesigner driven. But
oh yeah, nice.
Yeah, this project pulled from every single place that I had experimented when, as far as engineering control boxes and hardware, as far as like building a structure in 3D and like laying out the strips. I did all of that ahead of time before I even had the structure. So I actually cut the cables ahead of time, cut the strips ahead of time. Every strip was a different length, and it was mapped so where the zigzag patterns didn't overlap too much. It was trying to be efficient. It was painful.
So you were really thinking. You were really
yeah, and it probably was a little overkill. And this was, in hindsight, I learned a good lesson here is that more pixels are not necessarily better. Sometimes you want to not blast people in the face with 10,000 LEDs when they're right up in front of the.
We do have a good chat question. How do you deal with the huge electrical load needed in a forest?
Oh man,
do they got a Jenny or something out there?
They have. Well, the way Electric Forest does it is they actually trench up a lot of the ground, and they'll run power lines temporarily to all the places where installations are supposed to be. So you actually have power drops that are going to give you the power you need. Damn. Yeah, they're very organized in that sense. As far as the installation itself went, it was 5 volt, which, as you know, is horrible for power drop. But everything was so close together, didn't really matter so much. Anyways, couple last ones just to kind of wrap up the journey. So I did some gigs as well. You can probably recognize all these panels. This was with GeoPix. GeoPix was evolving in the background. It was still a tool that I was using for me, but kind of things kept progressing. And let's see, what is this? This is one of my vlog updates where I was talking about some of the viewports. This was... Oh yeah,
look at that. It's already kind of pretty fleshed out and becoming a whole thing.
Yeah, this was 2017. So this was 4 years ago or so. And this was back when I was styling it for 1.0. It was super orange, which is something I kind of stepped away from. It kind of looked a little... Not the greatest, but yeah, I mean, it's changed a lot since then, but there's some things that are the same. You got your object hull picks tabs on the side, and I was experimenting with this outliner, this floating GPU driven outliner thing that did not work out so well. So much of the programming is trying different things and axing the things that don't work.
We've got a beard for the win for you right now.
Beard for the
beard for the win. So, just think about it.
Awesome. Yeah. Let's see here. I think that's pretty much it. So I'll go ahead and show you 1, 2, or 3 more videos here that kind of show you where I got very recently. And so in 2019, I released GeoPix 1.0, which was for sale. It was the first time it had finally been available for sale as a thing. And this was the promo video for it, showing off different features. But the thing about this was that there's still a lot left to be desired. And honestly, and this is something we can maybe get into later, but I discovered that with sales not being very strong, I realized that maybe one of the reasons for this, there's probably a couple of reasons. One reason that I think I discovered was that new software in the lighting world just doesn't get adopted fast. It just doesn't, and it's slow progress. And then also once COVID kind of picked up, everything shut down, right? So there was not going to be sales
especially
after
in
that
the
too.
events space, right? Like,
right. So any potential people who might have been interested, were probably going to just hit pause on all that, understandably. And so that's kind of when I took a deep dive. It took a little bit of a break here and there, and I also went into a dive into this clustered shading stuff I started discovering. I was like, okay, how do I really render the points of light? So many points. And so, yeah, I started experimenting with some different rendering effects. This is was a tech demo I did kind of while I was developing stuff. A bunch of point lights and a bunch of cone lights, and the cone lights are actually projecting gobos through a volumetric haze and also on the wall there.
And we're going to get into this because this kind of like blows my mind. And I don't know if people just from seeing you know what really blew my mind? The video you sent me where there was all the particle lights flying around.
Oh, I have that here too. Let's see if I can find it. Oh, where did you go?
And this is in TouchDesigner.
Yes, this is running in TouchDesigner.
Yeah, so people aren't like, this is not Unreal or anything. This is in TouchDesigner. And we do have, hold on a sec, let me just check here. I see some questions in the chat. What interests you now in future goals? We'll come back to that. Okay, yeah, sorry. This video is sick. This video is sick.
And this really primes, I think, the conversation we'll have at some point later about the clustered shading, because what we're seeing here is thousands of point lights. I forget how many exactly. It might have been in the tens of thousands.
Each particle is essentially a light. Each
is
one of these, little...
like if you had a light comp, it would be doing the same math. It's essentially, and the only way this is possible to do in real time is with some serious optimizations, and that's something I spent a lot of time, months, researching. Is this algorithm called clustered shading, which is a 3D variant of tiled shading, which is a two-dimensional version that's kind of similar. But yeah, and so that's kind of where I went in 2019, and the last video I'll show here, just kind of brings us up to current day, is this one. You've probably seen it before if you've been to the GitHub, but yeah, this is basically where GeoPix is now, more or less, maybe
that's a beautiful
6 months back. Yes, we have some moving lights and some pixels, and they're all sprite based. There's some nice bloom effects. There's ambient occlusion, various effects, and you can see the actual, like, people think that this like a reflection. I haven't actually put SSR in here yet, but what you're seeing is the PBR materials, point lights. You can actually see each light point being rendered in the scene. So anyways, that's where things are at now. And now I've been working on more boring things, I guess you could say, in the software, just getting bugs fixed and getting features that need to be in there implemented. And so that kind of brings us to 2021.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. And like even just seeing that first version of GeoPix with the little UI in the corner all the way to that version now, that's insane. And I think before we even dive into GeoPix, I kind of wanted to pick your brain a little bit about tools in general. Just because I think there's a lot of difference between, I'm trying to think how to say it. There's levels to the game of tools, right? There's the tool you make for yourself, which maybe for a lot of people, even myself included, looks like that first version of GeoPix, right? You got a couple buttons, couple sliders, you know what they do. Maybe they're not labeled. You hit it. There's a launch code sequence that you have to do, otherwise it doesn't work. We all have something like that.
Oh yeah.
Then I feel like the next stage up is okay, well now you're really doing internal tooling, which is, it's a tool, it has to be kind of bug resilient, can't randomly stop working. It's the kind of thing you'd be confident to roll out into production and a permanent installation. And that could be whether it's for a company or for yourself. Maybe it doesn't have a slick UI, but it just does the things.
Right.
Then I think there's commercial grade tools. And immediately comes to mind is GeoPix, Luminosity, and those level of tools where not only is it, hey, we've gone to the trouble of making sure this is stable, it works, it has all these features, well designed user interface, we really thought about the user experience. I feel like there's so many more levels that come with that side of things. And I was curious to see what you found was surprising about, once you started taking GeoPix to that 1.0 level, and maybe what some of the hardest parts of that process were for you.
Oh man, that is there's a lot of points to that question. The most
I'm going to go back to the side by side. Do you need the screen?
No, I'm good for now.
We'll go back to side by side. We'll chit chat about tools and come back to GeoPix.
So yeah, I totally hear you. There's a time and place for doing things that extra mile, and that extra mile, which I guess building out the UI, making sure the UX. I guess if I were to break it down into what for me at least brings the tool past like that second phase you mentioned into the third phase, I would say it's having a polished UI and user experience, which means it has to be intuitive.
Yeah.
And that is not as straightforward as you think. You spend years or months or weeks staring at your code. It's just like, yeah, this is perfect. It makes perfect sense to me. And then you put it in front of somebody else, like, no.
They're like,
Yeah.
can you write the instructions, please? Because this is insane.
In the simplest things that, that there's this, and I've heard other people say this as well, but there's this like incredibly valuable is gold period of maybe like an hour to several minutes where you put your software in front of somebody else for the first time and you have several minutes to 10 or 20 or 30 minutes where like they're using it. That feedback is the most valuable thing you'll ever get, because as soon as you teach them anything about your software, they now don't need to intuit things. Yeah. They're tainted, essentially in a good way. But and it's not that you don't want people to have to learn your software, but you do want it to be as intuitive as you can to a point, right? There's obviously diminishing returns after a certain point, but that's tricky. And so there's going to be a lot of revisions to your UI, and UI is expensive to build. So if you're going to be building UI, just be ready for going through those iterations. Like, when somebody says it'd be nice to have this button up in the viewer that lets you kind of rotate the camera through a different set of control schemes, maybe the mouse, you're like, I didn't build my logic to even support that. Now I also have to, refactor.
Yeah, I have to gut the whole thing and start again. Thanks for the feedback.
The rule I tell people is like, never be afraid to ask for a feature, because you think it might be complicated, it might be dead simple, and you think it might be dead simple, it might be super complicated. And that's just like, you don't know until, you start looking at it. The other thing that, maybe this is 2 points. Point one kind of had a couple things, but the second thing is making sure that the software can perform at whatever level the user might be using it at. And if it's something that's very linear, where the user can only do a certain number of things and they're moving sliders and it's changing the output, that's a little bit less complicated to know what the final parameters are going to be. But if you're allowing users to create and destroy things, right, objects of some kind, that's where optimization becomes just an absolutely important thing to spend a lot of time in. And that goes into UI as well, right? Because if you have an object with 50 parameters, making sure those parameters can pop onto the screen and be quickly adjustable and they're lightweight, doesn't cause TouchDesigner to hang for 2 or 3 seconds while it loads. That's tricky, and that's probably the most complicated thing. I would say the most complicated. It's a thing that I've had to iterate on the most. I've rebuilt UI half a dozen times, and I mean like fully rebuilt entire toolkits of UIs just for GeoPix. And like every time I check something off the list that didn't work, and that's like a thing I have I've sunk a lot of time into that, and I've come to a place that I think is pretty solid. But I'm sure we'll get into that too later with Uber GUI and whatnot. Yeah,
we got some comments in the chat. Rob is mentioning Rob's got a friend in UX, and it's really not as simple as most people think, and you'd be amazed when testing how people don't understand what's going on. And actually, Rob's mentioning in my work we deploy apps to hundreds of I assume UAT is some kind of user something tester. I believe it's a user experience, something like that, before production, and on average 40% have errors on the first pass. So I think that kind of reinforces what you're mentioning. Like the first time they use it, like most people have no idea what's going on.
Right. Yeah, and sometimes, I think this is why you see so many softwares with similar schemes where you have some kind of attribute editing system on the right. Maybe you have some tools on the left. As far as 3D softwares go, I mean, if you go into After
that
Effects,
general paradigm.
Yeah. And
don't ask the makers of GIMP, because they don't care what anybody else. They're just going to make like random software that doesn't match the industry standards.
GIMP, I just recently opened GIMP because it was the only software I had that I could open something.
Throwing shade a little bit, but
Yeah. So that's that. I'd say those are the two biggest things: is making the UI scalable and developing the UI. That sucks a lot of time, but also optimizing everything else.
Yeah, it's interesting because so we had our toolkit, and that was like a thing before. And now those tools are kind of in the HQ Pro. And similar to what you're saying, like I was seeing this UI is like tricky. So I'm like, no tools UI. All they have is like some custom parameters. They're more developer focused, so in that case, like it was fine. And I would even add on to that, like one of the things I found very tricky was user support, bug fixing.
Yeah.
Because once you're on the hook, when people start paying money, and they're like, "I paid money. Can you fix this like in 30 minutes?" And I'm like, "No, sorry. I got like other things I got to do."
Yeah.
I was never really expecting that kind of in that tool world, like the whole user support, QA for testing stuff, versioning became a tricky thing. Like even in my best intentions of having V 1.0.1, and then like if I make a change 1.0.2, and then after a while I just forgot to change it, and you know.
I could relate to all. Yeah,
versioning out the window. Like it's just download the newest one, please. Like don't worry about just download the newest one, and you're good to go.
Yeah, that's a really great point, and I forgot to mention that. But that, yeah, all the stuff that surrounds building, like people typically build software, and you have to like concern yourself with making sure the software is consistently presented each time, and I always would forget to write the new version numbers, so I had to start adding that into like a build script. And now with TouchDesigner's pre-save execute dat function, you can actually just like call a bunch of stuff automatically, and so that's working its way into my workflow more and more every day. And yeah, that's a big one. Support is tricky.
Support's crazy.
Yeah, and you really don't expect people to break things, but they always do, and that's just goes to show that people always use your software in different ways than you expect, and you can't really predict that. You have to budget in time for an enormous amount of like user feedback and testing and iterating on that. It's just part of the game.
And I find the funny thing is, I don't know if you've experienced this with users. They try and do something that the software kind of does, like the tool shouldn't really do. And then they make it seem like it's your fault that it can't do that thing. They're like, yes. Well, like, why not? Like, you're like, well, I don't know. Like, I did because I didn't put it in there. Like, did you read the feature list? Like, it doesn't do that. But they're like, well, and then they get all, and then it's like you're the bad guy because you didn't have a feature in there. I don't know if you've experienced that, but
yeah, in some sense, yeah, because when you build software that's flexible and it does different things, people want to flex it into different ways, and that's understandable. But yeah, it ends up becoming either a feature or a dead end that takes some time to kind of figure out, okay, is this worth implementing? Is this something anybody else wants? Because you can't take every edge case and make it into a feature. It's just not feasible in terms of time. But also sometimes those workflows are really valuable, and you want to be like, maybe I didn't think about this, but this would be a good thing to support. So it's a careful balance.
Totally. So I think with that, like, we could totally dive into looking at GeoPix a little bit. I'll bring back the screen sharing, and not to be, I don't think the word is pedantic, but it's something like that word. Like, do you mind giving like a quick 5-10 minute here's what GeoPix looks like, and like here's how I add a few nodes? Because I think hey, listen, and chat, like I'm calling out the chat. I'm calling out the chat for a second, because listen, I'm guilty of this also. We do that thing where we're like, oh, we saw 2 pictures of a tool, and we think, okay, well, we fully understand the tool. I never have to download it and like look at it and try it and see what it does. We're like, oh yeah, 2 pictures. I know the name and 2 pictures. Like, I know exactly what this tool does. And I think, like, especially when I saw kind of how GeoPix has been evolving, like, I am totally blown away by how amazing. Like, if it was up to me, like, this should be in the palette. Like, this is like better than most palette tools. I would almost say it's better than all the palette tools. No shots fired, but like, this is a very amazing tool that you've built. So, and I think that's why I kind of want to make, like, I just want to, like, hey, for the chat, like, here, like, look at what you've been missing by not having tried this out yet.
Well, that's very kind of you. Yeah, so this is GeoPix, and I'll do a quick brief setup, but I think it'll actually be valuable for talking about some of the stuff we want to get into a little bit later with the clustered shading. We didn't get into this in the video we did last week, but I'm going to go ahead and set up a fixture here, and also let me create some geometry, because that's half the fun, is seeing things light up in the viewport. I will bring in, let's see here, bring in the default
I like the people
cube.
You have in there.
Yeah, it's kind of a random collection of stuff, but it's just stuck around for years, and now it's becoming almost like the banana for me. I can't not have it. Arch stage.
Do you make Easter eggs in your tools?
I should. I guess I don't as much, but yeah.
I feel like it would be amazing if you had a doctor like human model, like full, like, you know, like doctor's coat, stethoscope, like it's just like, why is there a doctor in the LED preface?
Yeah, you rename one of your meshes to like doctor, and it just auto populates a bunch of stuff.
That'd be
So
awesome.
this is the art. You might have remembered this from the video I showed earlier. This is actually that structure, and this is actually what his software would output. It was super detailed. You get in here and see the bolts and everything, and he'd have the bend angles for all the bars. But nonetheless, this is just something I've incorporated into GeoPix as some test stuff. It's honestly really simple. If anyone has been following GeoPix, you'll recognize these assets for sure.
Oh, those are great. You got all kinds of stuff in here, just like ready to roll.
Yeah, this was just a set that I wanted to include. And this is helpful because with a fixture here, go into hull mode, you can just go over here and start clicking and drawing pixels directly on the mesh. And
which is super, I mean...
Well, I'm sorry, these are not pixels, these are hulls.
Mind blown immediately already.
Yeah, and so these are hulls. These are actually not pixels, but they are kind of like the guiding structure that allows you to generate pixels in a more dynamic way, so you don't have to constantly, tweak them manually. So typical roll LEDs.
I'm going to move my face out of the way just because as you're in the parameters.
Yeah, and then let's see here. So they're kind of overlapping with the mesh, so you can scoot this out a little bit. Let's try it out to here. It's fine.
And all you did for that was basically just drop those hull points along the 3D mesh, and then basically say put like 150 pixels or 100 pixels or whatever number of pixels along it.
Yeah, and the way the generators are really useful is they're constantly updating, so you can draw stuff out and then tweak it, and you can actually position it back without having to redraw all of those pixels. So all right, we got this. I won't get too crazy here. I'm just going to duplicate this fixture and scale it on X -1. And so now we've got kind of a left and a right fixture. And so that's cool. I'm going to make a quick primitive object. It's a projector, so we'll need that here soon enough.
Yeah, and someone was asking in the chat, is GeoPix only for LED stuff? And absolutely not. Like, it supports so much.
Yeah, and I'll show you guys the custom fixture thing too, which is really important. It's a huge feature, and I haven't even had a chance to make any tutorials for it yet, but I think people will enjoy getting to know that as well. So, all right, we got some pixels.
So you made a projector there.
Yes, this is a projector, which is how it's got nothing going on right now, but this is how you put content on your LEDs. So if I just set it to a constant color of red, you can see that these pixels are now on, and go ahead and make a quick macro, and we can start seeing things do stuff. This macro will just have...
I think this was the part that I love this when folks make node-based programming inside of TouchDesigner. I love that.
Silly, yeah, I know. I couldn't help myself. And plus, it's a really good workflow.
It's hard. It's not easy.
No, optimizing it is the tricky thing, too, because you've got wires, and so much GLSL goes into this because you really can't put all of these things inside of each object. You have to like downstream that to a place where the data is prepared and it's being rendered some other way. But yeah, hats off to Derivative for making such optimized software. I have a lot more respect for that after trying to make my own node-based system.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so we've got just a simple blue ramp, and if we go back over here, turn off the red, we have that hitting the pixels. So I'll turn off this projector.
It's like literally less than 5 minutes to make that.
Yeah, so it's pretty quick. Of course, depending on what you're doing, it might take longer. You might be measuring out specifically, but I found that so much of the time you don't really need to be like super specific with your pixels. You just need to be close enough. Nobody's going to notice it for an art installation that's organic, but if you're doing like an LED wall, that's a different situation.
Yeah.
So the thing we didn't get into before was the lighting. And by default, GeoPix runs in a fairly optimized state where you're just seeing the pixels and some bloom. The bloom just kind of gives you a little bit of glow. We could turn down the global environment light brightness, and we can turn on the point lights, which basically gives you some emission.
Wow. Yeah.
And so this is really just lighting up a very small radius at the moment, but I can grab our fixtures and boost up the radius here. You've got some lighting parameters, set this to 500, which will probably hurt performance a bit. It's not too bad, but it's a little bit bright now.
That's assuming you had the brightest LEDs like on Earth.
Right, yeah. This doesn't have any like real world brightness metrics built in yet, so you kind of have to tweak it until it looks about right. So that's maybe a little bit more realistic. You'll notice that the frame rate's fluctuating pretty wildly, and this is even with clustered shading, which this is using that algorithm. The way it works we'll get into, but essentially it's culling lights based on so every pixel. Traditionally, every pixel renders every single light, even if that light's not affecting it. But clustered shading basically says, okay, this pixel is only being lit by lights 1, 2, 5, and 7. Let's only calculate those, and let's not calculate the rest. And so you save a huge amount of performance if your lights are spread out. But if your lights are close together, every pixel is still probably this pixel right on the DJ board is going to be hit by every one of these lights because they're so close together. So that's kind of a caveat. And as I zoom in, you'll notice the performance gets worse. And this is just because it's a dynamic algorithm. It's not fixed anymore. And
just to put it into perspective, when we say worse, like it's still like 30 FPS.
Yeah, this is 300 light sources on screen working in real time.
Yeah, I was going to say this is 30. Worse is still holding 30 with essentially 300 lights in a 3D previs environment that looks like great. So it's like, you know what? Like I've had the 30 FPS less intensive things before.
Yeah, I mean, you can't even use that many light comps, I think, because of some other limitations. And this is kind of a deferred hybrid forward shading setup. So it's got some of the best of both worlds. Almost forgot. Let me throw a texture on the ground here because that's quite fun as well. You can kind of see some of the actual shading. Actually have the PBR workflow is fully supported and stuff, so you can see that specular action. You can also set this to metallic. You can really see those points if you make it a mirror surface. So yeah, there's lots of possibility here for doing previs. And what's cool, on top of and this is a little confusing because I'm talking about clustered shading, which is an algorithm, but there's also a clustering optimization underneath that clustered shading. And to kind of show you that, let me turn on the emitters so you can actually visualize. So each of these yellow things is a light, right? It's just casting light. And so what the clustering algorithm here does when you turn it on is it takes some time and it recalculates the light distributions, and it takes 3 lights and it averages it into 1 light. It doesn't actually average it, it adds it. Yeah. So it's a way of creating a sparser light grid that's more consistently dense. So if I take this to 32, you'll see a little bit more what's happening. It's basically interpolating this spline that you could say it's a spline. What it's actually doing is it's using the Python k-means library, or k-means might be the clustering algorithm, I'm not sure, but yeah, it's basically,
I think k-means is a clustering one, right?
Yeah. So it's a library that you can get. It's already out there in the world, and it's very useful because you can take a 3D point cloud and you can reduce it down to a set of clusters. Like this cluster represents these points, this cluster represents these points, and so basically I'm summing up. So this light right here, number 11, right? Maybe it's actually a combination of all of these pixels right here, which you can't really see the marquee. And so what it's doing is it's taking all of those values before it actually goes to the render, and it's adding it together, and it's saying emit that from this point. And so it's reducing the amount of lights, but it's still giving you an approximation. So that's basically what gets us the rest of the way in GeoPix. Is you can see it here really clearly, right? You're actually rendering less lights, but
yeah, true. Yeah, it becomes a little bit more evident on the reflection there.
Right. And so to the person in the comments point, so custom fixtures kind of takes you into non-pixel territory, and I think this will load with the default that I have in here. I hope it does. Yeah, so there is a mover. This is kind of one I have behind me, actually, if you can see it, just to the side of my face.
Yeah.
And of course, right now it's not doing anything, and that's because this light has more than RGB. It's got a dimmer channel. So, when you get into this kind of territory, you have to start setting up more projectors. Things do get a little bit more complicated to kind of use a video workflow. But let's see here. the dimmer. Whoa.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting that like all of that happens automatically, like behind the, basically you just turned on that clustering thing and like it's like, don't worry, I got you. Like I'll
Yes.
calculate everything that needs to happen behind the scenes. Because now it looks like it basically doing that jumped it back up to more or less 60 FPS.
Yeah, it definitely helped a lot. Let me open this guy real quick.
And that doesn't, because that, and then the interesting thing is that, and I think we'll dive into behind the scenes of it pretty shortly, but the interesting part for me is that you have that whole workflow. That's just for previs. Like the output is still the same regardless if you turn clustering on and off, because you still need to address all of these pixels and you have a whole optimized workflow for that kind of thing. But then this is just, how can I make this UI optimized, smooth experience for people?
Just to make the viewport as optimized as it possibly could be.
Yeah.
All right, so there might be, is this something I hadn't prepared to show, so maybe there's some issues here. Dimmer, shutter. Yeah, okay.
Oh, so those are all the channels of the fixture. So you can basically like make any kind of...
anything you want. Yeah, you can design, this is kind of like the GDTF builder in the web. You can build your own like set of transforms and objects, and you can also throw emitters in there. I did not... this is something that probably is broken in the latest version of Touch, which I have not tested thoroughly. So, I
think that's fine. I think
glitches, but
folks get the idea that like you can do a lot of stuff in GeoPix, and
the idea is that you can address the other channels of a fixture with different projectors. So, you might have a texture coming out of this macro that's going to be controlling pan and tilt. And it's
interesting. So you could use like a noise on the projector to say, but then assign that to like, pan, tilt, or any of the other kind of
allows you to like stick with the video workflow for all of it, so that you can really package all of your looks and control channels into like a set of textures, and that's just basically playing inside of the macro. So but yeah, and then I guess to say, let's see if I can turn on the volumetrics here. With the points, it's not as interesting because it's just a sphere, a glowy sphere, but you can previs that as well. So
that's awesome. We got a nice comment in the chat that says Derivative needs to hire you to improve the built-in 3D viewer.
It's something I'm passionate about. Building 3D, rendering techniques and algorithms is like, I'm thrilled about that kind of stuff. So
is that like a good segue for us to kind of dive in a little bit behind the scenes? Because I have a couple of questions about the whole culled lighting and clustered lighting, even from a non-technical perspective, that I think would be like really interesting for the viewers, because coming from digital, like kind of 3D art, going into gaming, and then coming into LEDs and Arduinos, you didn't really have that software computer science training.
Right.
And I think for a lot of folks, and even myself included, like when I hear something like that, they're like, oh, well, we could implement clustered lighting. It's almost like a binary decision gets made in my head where I'm like, well, that sounds like really hard computer science. I'm out. Like, call someone else for that, because I don't want to deal with that. Like, if it still sounds more on the, oh, well, we need to make a system that like does this and this and this, lots of like logic, like state machine, like, okay, cool, like, I'm in. But then when there seems to be that invisible line, and I feel like recently in the TouchDesigner space, like a lot of people have been crossing that with GLSL. Like I think GLSL 5 or 10 years ago kind of had that same feeling where people are like, man, shaders, like, no, I can't. But now with so much more materials out there, like people are taking, I mean, people who are, it's always, I see people who, can't use shuffle chop, and they're like, no, I'm going like really deep into shaders. I'm like, okay, cool, have fun with that, but we still got to learn TouchDesigner also. And I feel like with culled, this whole culling system and the clustered lighting, what made you take that step into it and say, you know what, like I can tackle this? And maybe like if you don't mind giving some of the viewers a little bit of insight into your thought process of like how you tackled it, because it sounds like it was not an easy, trivial thing to get into.
No, that's a great question. What made me want to get into it was, first of all, I didn't know I could pull it off. I actually didn't. That's just how I operate. I'm like, what is this super complicated thing that's just maybe barely achievable? And then I'll go after that. And that's how I learn things. I bite off way more than I can chew, and then I find a way to chew it. But this particular one, there was a few resources online that I found, and I'll go ahead and give them the shout out to them, because
yeah.
they were
Awesome.
they were really helpful, and I don't think I would have pulled this off without these. Well, this guy specifically. There's a few places out there, and by the way, all these resources, they really come into play in the real-time game industries. And if you haven't heard them by name, don't worry. I mean, it's probably implemented in all of the major ones, like Unreal. I think, what's it called? Unreal, and what's the other big one? Unity. Yeah, Unity. I think they both have this. I've seen some open source game engines implement this. Google Filament also has this implemented, and this is
what's Filament? What is that? Is that something I should know, but I don't know?
Yeah, I think so. Although it's
self-report.
Yeah, so it's this open source game engine that's got every conceivable like modern day technique already built into it. It's got clustered shading. It's got beautiful like reflections, and it's just PBR support out the wazoo, and it has transparency, and so you can dig through this code. It's very heavy GitHub repository, but you can find almost any kind of effect that you want. And what they've done is they've also put let me see if I can find their manual.
And while you're looking for that, Rob had a question in the chat. I wonder if Lucas has used GeoPix to control his stage setup. And I think the answer for that is yes, because you kind of built it alongside of doing, like earlier when we were seeing some of those early examples and prototype versions of it. I mean, you kind of built it to do projects and shows and things like that.
Yeah, it was never in the beginning intended to be like a previs tool. That kind of grew as I needed to see complex things before I showed up on the day of a gig, because that you just don't have time to like test LED content out. You really need to be able to see it. But yeah, lots of gigs. Those are kind of my testing ground. I go back and forth between development and these gigs with some friends and stuff I had, very low key, and it was easy to experiment and try new things. Yeah, I won't spend too much more time looking for this core
and
document.
So Filament looks like you're mentioning it's like a free thing, like folks can just go on GitHub and check out Filament.
Definitely check it out. Crazy. I would love if Derivative implemented this into TouchDesigner, because it's also they have releases as basically a set of things that you can, I think, link through C++. I'm sure this is not a simple thing to implement.
One of those embedded renderer type of things.
Yeah, I don't know if it'd even be possible through a series of C++ chops and tops and sops to do all this kind of stuff, but like it has so much going for it. And also they have this beautiful manual where they don't just tell you what's in it.
That's nice.
They explain the equations. It's such a great place to get your feet wet and at least learn some of the terms that you might need to look up if you're trying to like figure out how to do certain things. They talk about the
Fresnel.
Fresnel.
I got PTSD from Fresnel from a couple months ago. So
they talk about how
too soon.
environment lights work. They have all kinds of things, metallics, roughness.
That's crazy. That looks like it's just a great resource in general.
It is, and I spent a lot of time here. But that's not the first thing I found. The first thing I found was this guy's blog. This guy A. Ortiz. What's his first name? I don't remember. But he has this really well described, kind of starting from a fairly low amount of knowledge about the topic, about how deferred shading works and how clustered shading fixes some of the problems.
Code examples.
Yeah, he has a GitHub too where you can look at stuff. These are a lot of pseudocode examples. So this was the one that got me the most. This is what got me to the point where it's like, I think I can do this. I think I can pull it off. So this is also a good place to kind of explain some of the cluster shading stuff, I guess. If you want to dive into that next.
Yeah, let's do it.
Cool.
And we can talk about it as a high level thing. I think it's just really interesting for folks. And then we can kind of transition into looking at kind of maybe how you set up some of that stuff inside of GeoPix. Because in my mind, I'm thinking like, okay, well, it's probably in a shader somewhere. But I think for a lot of folks, they have no idea like what's the input, what's the output, like what does this actually look like in implementation?
Yeah. Trying to think if there's a diagram here that helps. This helps. This will be a good primer before I jump into Touch. But normally when you render a scene, let's say you have 3 lights. You have one light that might be right here, another light that might be right here, and let's say your third light is 200 miles away. And if it's a game, right, it would be pretty far away. In like a totally naive rendering situation, that third light, which has no impact on what you see, is still being calculated. And so that's kind of where you run into a bottleneck very quickly. When you have light comps in TouchDesigner, currently they're just used like this, right? It doesn't matter where they are. There's no optimization that says this is too far away, don't calculate it. And So that's kind of the problem, and the way that this solves it is it takes your perspective view frustum, which is not a perfect cube when you look at it in world space. It's kind of like this skewed structure, and it says, okay, you got this light up here. This yellow dots, right? And it splits your view frustum up into voxels, and it says this light only affects voxels 1, 2, 3, 7, 8, and 9. And so you create this low res voxel grid where basically you have buckets. You can think of each thing as a bucket, where in this bucket you have this list of lights that affect it, right? So it's a much smaller list of lights because it's you're taking care of figuring out, because it's a little expensive to figure out which light affects a certain point in space. But if you do it to a low res grid and then you check to see which pixels belong to which voxels, it's a way of downsizing the part that doesn't scale well about this. So anyways,
you do this, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So basically what happens is you have this 3-dimensional voxel grid, and then you start looking at your pixels on the screen. And so in GeoPix, any pixel, right? Literally any pixel in screen space, you ask.
And that's important. Sorry, pixels are in screen space when we're talking about those pixels here.
Yeah, so you're taking the depth, right? Because you can get the depth top, and you can grab the depth, and you can, with the X and Y position on the screen, you can calculate the position in world space very trivially that way. And so you take that world space position and you say, which voxel am I in? And then you take that voxel and you say, which lights are affecting this voxel? And then you take that list of lights, which is really just a list of indices that point to a super long light list, right? You have 100 lights, but this voxel has a list of 3 indices that point to lights in that master list. And so basically, it's like a double or triple lookup, but it's still way cheaper than calculating all those lights. And then you basically go loop through 3 lights in your pixel shader instead of 100. And so every pixel has a different list, right? But depending on which voxel it falls into, this pixel right here might have a list of 10 lights, whereas this one might have a list of 3 lights. And depending on where it is, different pixels will have to do different amounts of work. So you're kind of at the mercy of the worst case pixel. So if you have a pixel that is doing a lot of work, or if you have enough that are doing a lot of work, it's going to drag your frame rate down, which is why we saw this dip earlier with all of these lights affecting it.
I think an interesting, so just to kind of run that back in a breakdown high level. So, and I think for folks who don't know what a voxel is, it's pretty fair to just call a voxel a 3D pixel box.
Yeah, let me actually pull up a nice visual that I think will help. So in GeoPix here, the actual camera. So here is, this doesn't quite look like a grid, but it kind of does. So you can see this is the camera's perspective frustum, right? And so each of these dots, I don't know if you can see those. Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, let me see. Yeah. Oh, yeah, sweet. Perfect.
There we go. So yeah, starting from the origin, you have all of these dots. And so each of these dots actually has some additional SOP attributes, a min and a max. So really each point represents a bounding box.
And it's that's the center of the bounding box.
Right, exactly, yeah.
And each one of those bounding boxes is kind of like your voxel.
Right, yeah, and so each of these has a sub list of lights. It might be 3, it might be 5, whatever. And this is statically generated, and even when I'm moving around the scene, this is not recalculating. It only recalculates when you change the perspective, because that's a projection space thing. So that's the voxel grid. That's kind of what it looks like.
Crazy. Yeah, and then to your point, so it basically uses that, and you look up in the screen space on your 2D space, pixel this is inside of this kind of bounding box, which lights are affecting this bounding box.
Exactly, yeah.
And it becomes this almost super... It's one of those things that you're oh, you explained it sounds so simple, but...
Well, the high level it's actually a fairly understandable thing. It's the nuts and bolts of it. So, for example, one of the things that took me a very long time to figure out, and I should point to another very kind individual who's an expert in their field. And again, this is another game industry person, I think, veteran for sure. This guy Bart Ronsky, I think I'm pronouncing that right. Cone culling, right? So when you check a sphere, when you want to find out if a point is lit by a sphere, all you have to really do is say, what's the maximum radius of that light, and is this point further from that radius or closer than that radius? So it's a distance calculation essentially. But when it comes to cones, you have to do a distance calculation to see if it's within that cone's distance, but also you got to find out if it's in the view frustum of that cone.
Yeah.
Right. So there's some dot product stuff. And so this This guy found a really interesting algorithm, or he came up with it, I think, because this is like the problem with the kind of more naive way is all the space in the circle that is not gray is basically wasted space, right? If you land a pixel in there, a good chance it's not being calculated if it's a very wide cone. So, anyways, it's a great article.
Oh, I love these GIFs. These GIFs are
very helpful. It's very very deep, but it explains it from a 2D perspective, then it goes to a 3D perspective and has some code. And the code finally, allowed me to like implement that through some tweaks and just kind of getting it working in Touch. So you can see the reds. Yeah, the red squares are the ones that are being like considered in the cone. All right, maybe that was actually no. Here it is. This is a super optimized. You can see that it's ignoring most of the stuff that's not in the cone. So this is really important for doing like cone lights because you're doing not just lighting, but gobos and other more heavy calculations. So making sure the cone was really culled as tightly as possible to the shape of the cone is important. So great resources. Those were the ones that probably I spent the most time reading. I swear I read those things like 10 or 15 times because things just sink in after the 10th time. And
I'll say for folks that are like they're recording this, don't worry, it's going to be on YouTube. So if you need to like look up any of these resources and you like missed it immediately, like don't worry, run it back. On the 10th watch, like Lucas is saying, on the 10th time you watch the whole thing, without skipping ads, hopefully, or something like that. You know what I'm talking about? But like 10th time you watch it, that's what it all clicks.
Yeah, it's definitely that's the thing. A piece of advice to people who feel stuck on stuff is don't stop. Go back to the thing you read twice or 3 times and read it again. You'd be surprised, especially after you spend some time Googling other things, trying to find other easier solutions. Come back to the original thing, that paper. It'll make a little more sense. And if it made a little more sense, do that process again. And eventually, I swear, some of these things, the reason why it took months is because I don't have a traditional background in any of this stuff. I'm just figuring it out from what I can find online through Shader Toy. And like you read enough places that are doing something similar and you start to see patterns, you start to know what these terms mean. And it's just a process, but yeah.
So it sounds like really like patience.
Patience is a big one.
Was like a really big part of this process because, and I think for a lot of people, maybe they do that thing where they're like, I'll tackle it, and then they read the paper twice and then they're like, oh man, I still don't get it. Or the third time they still don't get it. And to your point, like you've read that thing like 10 times over a span of months, every time, like, trying to figure out some other piece using other resources. And I think it's really interesting because, I mean, the result that you've created is like beautiful, efficient, like super technically interesting and cool. And I think for a lot of folks, just them seeing, them seeing themselves in you? I think that's the direction, right? Is that the direction? Or no, they see that you and themselves? No, it's the other way around. So, folks can imagine themselves as you and be like, oh, well, this is possible. Like, these things that are really technical and feel like, oh, only a software computer scientist who works on game engines could ever tackle these things. But with patience and dedication and like really just going through that struggle of it.
Yeah, I had 1 month of Python programming in college and I failed it the first time. It's any consolation to people. And the second time I passed it, I forgot everything after college. And then I had to relearn Python on the first job I had just to do some rendering. So yeah, just got to keep chipping away at it for sure. So I guess to kind of dive a little bit more into this cluster shadings things, you have the fixture buffer, right? And we mentioned this in the last video, but basically the end of GeoPix, the pipeline, right before things go out to your real life pixels, you have this buffer, which is 512 wide by however many universes tall. So it's a very simple buffer. You can look at it, and even though it's not intuitive visually, it's intuitive like technically. You know exactly what each of these pixels means.
And I think that was like a really nice thing I enjoyed from when we did the last video was that you did it in the mind. It's like, okay, well, each line is a universe.
Yeah, it keeps it. It's a grounding point because you can always go there and be like, am I crazy? Is this working? Is it working here? Is it not working here? And you can just check it, right, with the tools built into Touch, which are great. Just go in here and be like, yeah, this is this is definitely a negative value. Why is it negative? I should check into that or whatever. So this is being ingested from the end of GeoPix. So at the end, that data either leaves GeoPix and goes out to your pixels, or in the case of like visualizing it on the screen, it kind of comes back to the viewer and it gets used in a different way. And so this kind of goes into this kind of wire's nest of a comp that takes all of these lighting samples, like their coordinates and various attributes, like their attenuation fall off and things like that.
Everything you need to basically like calculate that cone.
Right, because the lighting is being calculated, we're looping through lights on the GPU, not doing light comps. There's no light comps in this setup.
So there's literally like no light comp in the whole project.
Yeah, except for the environment light comp. That's the only one, but that's kind of a different thing entirely. But yeah, because there's like a limit to the number of light comps you can even attach to. So technically, you could implement a clustered shading algorithm and use light comps, and that's something I thought would be really cool to do. Because it would be really natively integrated into Touch, a lot less moving parts that are new. But you're still limited by how many light comps you can plug into a render texture before you have to add another render pass. And that kind of just gets heavy, right? And hopefully the Vulkan stuff, whenever that comes, hopefully soon. Yes, I'm looking forward to it.
Are we going to start the TouchDesigner on Linux right about now? Like, is this where we're going? Like, let's light it up.
Oh, man. Yeah, so that I think will open up doors for people who either want to implement it themselves or, I don't know what path Derivative wants to go down after that. I'm sure they have lots of other stuff to do that we don't know about, that's related to Vulkan. But that is kind of a limitation that we can't get around with the light comps until that's like, we can get around that. We kind of have to do things in a deferred approach, which is okay. Honestly, it's more work, but once it's working, it's pretty viable too. So basically, we have these unreadable textures of just like data. Every pixel is like 4 different attributes of a light, and a light's like, I don't know, 16 or 20 attributes. So every 4 or 5 pixels represents a light in its entirety, whether it's its coordinates, its attenuation, its brightness. And this kind of gets coalesced into a buffer that's a little bit more linear, I guess, more like the other DMX buffer. It stops at 1280 wide because I wanted this to work with the non-commercial edition, and so that it loops around the next row. And so that texture right there, and there's a lot going on in this shader I won't go into, but this is basically taking like rotation, if it's a gobo indices, all these things that need to change in real time. It kind of gets massaged into place here so that when it hits the actual shader that's doing the lighting, it's pulling from this in a much simpler way. And so this basically gets looped through. This is kind of like the main light buffer, and so each voxel references an index inside this texture. This is actually the thing that's being referenced when the actual lighting happens.
And I think for folks that are maybe familiar with other GLSL workflows, this is kind of like, it's almost like the lighting equivalent of the textures you make when you're doing like a GPU particle system.
Yeah,
where, like,
it really is like that.
The pixel is like the particle RGB or particle XYZ or velocity or any of these other things that are stored in these textures. We're kind of doing like a similar thing here, but with all of your like lighting information and then the voxel information.
Yeah, there's like the visual aesthetic GLSL, and there's like the number crunching GLSL, and there's so much more of the number crunching variety floating around in here because it's the only way to make it scalable. It really is, and a lot of it's suited to paralleling. So yeah, that goes into the surface shading, and there's a couple shaders in here that by the way, something I don't know if most people they've probably seen it, but they're maybe not too aware, is the render top has GLSL inputs for samplers and uniforms. This is
I'm not gonna lie, I don't know what they do. What do they do?
Oh man, this is a game changer, because if you have something in a shader that has to animate, you might plug a chop, right, that animates. Maybe it's a selection parameter. Maybe it's like a pulse that goes up, down, up, down, up, down. It's like an LFO, and you want that to be like a visual cue. Plugging that into the shader is fine when it's just one shader, but if you duplicate that object and you have 50 objects, you have 50 of those shaders that have just a little bit of cook time, and that adds up. So what you can do is plug some of those moving variables into your render top and name them, and you can access them in the shader just like you could if you were plugging them directly into the shader. Yeah, it's incredible.
All I can do is just a deep breathe out. I'm like, interesting.
Yeah,
very interesting.
And with the ability to add more of these like parameters, which I'm so glad they added that, because it really lets you add whatever you need. And this is far more efficient because it lets your shaders be static. nothing changes on them. Once they're there, they're there. And another cool feature of render tops, which is very much related to that, and let me figure out where I'm using this. So something that I can't see because I don't actually, not gonna worry about it. But the custom fixtures, if this was working and we could show you, the way that we render out the custom fixtures, like lighting attributes, because they need to fit into that buffer I showed you earlier in the same way, but it's coming from a different place. I can't assemble that in shop space because they're entirely on the GPU already. They're calculating this stuff. So what I did is for every emitter in every custom fixture, there is a single vertex, and that vertex represents an emitter. So it's just got a bunch of information attached to it, and when information isn't attached to it, it's kind of read in. And so this render top, as you can see, it's rendering absolutely nothing visually, but one of the things you can do that I had never messed with until I started fooling around with this whole process is the image output. So in the render top GLSL1 tab, you can output just a buffer texture. It can be any resolution, any depth, any format, and it can even be a 2D texture array if you want. And this allows you to take a pixel and treat it as a compute shader, essentially. You're basically telling that pixel can, in the vertex shader, right? So you can skip all of this expensive pixel shader stuff. That vertex can basically write stuff out to a texture buffer wherever you want, whatever pixel address you want. And I think it's similar to a compute shader. And this lets you just pipe stuff down into other places using vertex shaders as like a really slim compute shader, essentially, where instead of having a bunch of pixels, you just have a bunch of vertices. And so that's dead useful. That's probably
crazy. We'll need a whole workshop on that. We're gonna need to run that technique back through another 2-hour live stream.
Yeah, it's really cool. And there's one other thing. Oh yeah, so the clustering, and this is kind of what I know you wanted to like go into, and so calculating which voxels have which lights. That's probably the last piece of this puzzle that's worth showing.
Yeah, because I think it would be like super cool to jump into Uber GUI and talk about like that and how compares and contrasting as GeoPix. Yeah,
so this depth buffer, right? This is literally just the depth buffer of the screen. It's like a square, and you can't see anything because they're all values and 32-bit above 1. But that's being passed into this shader, and this shader is generating these indices, right? And these, in the red channel here, these indices correspond to a voxel, like a voxel index. So basically we're saying this pixel belongs to this voxel, and we're creating this this intermediary texture that kind of represents that. And then over here in the cluster ID, this is a little more interesting because you can actually see stuff, but these looks like Morse code.
Yeah.
The display, there we go. So you'll see that as I move around the view, these are changing. And what this is essentially saying is like, so pixel 0, right, which is the bottom left pixel, is voxel 0. And it's basically saying, is there any lights in this voxel? And so as you move around, your voxel assignments change. And so this is like a pre-optimization pass that allows the shader downstream to say, okay, I can totally ignore this voxel because there's nothing in it. So that's like active clusters. And then that comes into this thing called Froxel block, which is the most understandable texture, even though it's still pretty cryptic. So see these things. Yeah, these
like
things,
audio visualizer.
it kind of is like a light density visualizer, I guess. But so the first row down here, this is a 2D texture, so it's just a way of cramming things into a 1280 by 1280 constraint. But the first row is voxel 0, and so if I go in here and just mouse over this, you basically have, from left to right, the first pixel says there are this many lights in this voxel, and then every pixel thereafter until you hit that limit is the indice to that light in the master buffer that you need to look up to. So this is what actually gets referenced in the pixel shader. So the pixel shader says, okay, this is voxel ID this. It looks into this texture and it says, how many pixels do I need to loop through, or how many lights? It loops through those lights, and it looks into that other buffer to get that actual lighting information, and it calculates it from there. So that's
kind of that like double, triple lookup that you were mentioning earlier, happening right here.
It looks up into the lookup, which looks into
the lookup, and there's another lookup before that. Yeah.
So I know that's like blowing through it. It's kind of like what, but it's a series of optimizations, sequential optimizations that when you get to the pixel shader, it's just giving the pixel shader less work to do, because that's any optimization is figuring out where you can cut corners and cutting them. So yeah,
I think it's amazing. It's like when you first told me last week, I was like, what is this? And then you showed me and I was like, okay, cool. And then you sent me the video and I was like, amazing. And now you're telling me now and I'm like, this is like mind bending. And I think it's so obviously folks like don't expect that in an hour and 20 minutes, like you're like, yeah, I totally get this. I'm hanging on by a thread. I'm like hanging on by my teeth also. So like, we're in the same boat, chat. But I would say, so a nice thing is that obviously like this is recorded so folks can come back, watch this later. GeoPix is also now open source. So folks can literally like download this and start looking around inside, referencing these shaders, looking at the resources that you mentioned kind of like earlier, comparing those to your implementations. That's something that folks can do. So I think probably like a really cool thing would be to show how folks can get GeoPix. And then we'll kind of transition over and talk about UberGUI, because I think there's a lot of folks excited about that. And I think that one's a sick one too. Like that's a sick tool.
Yeah, definitely. Well, cool. Yeah, so to actually get GeoPix, you can get a geopix.io, and there's like it's just a landing page for now, but it's a very helpful landing page. It's got all the links you could possibly need there at the top.
I'm putting it in the chat, folks. I'm putting it in the chat.
Oh, yes, right on. And then basically go to the GitHub. If you just go to GitHub and search for GeoPix, you'll find it too. So, once you get to the GitHub here, I recommend, if you just want to quickly dig around and check it out, probably use the code button here. It's the easiest. But if you actually want to stay up to date and start using it, I recommend doing the GitHub desktop checkout route so that you can just pull updates. And the way I've built all of this with the start bat, you should be able to very seamlessly just kind of continue to run the updates, and you don't have to like reinitialize everything from the GitHub repo that way.
Oh, interesting.
So this is, there's so much going on that it prevents me from just like flooding this with tutorials constantly, but I've gotten a good few up here, and I'm going to keep adding them as soon as I have time. And this will be basically filling out the question marks. And so if you have questions too, please shoot them as a issue or discussions, because that helps me know what tutorial to make next. But
oh yeah, totally. Folks, like, listen, I know you might hear this before from people doing stuff on GitHub, but like, there's really nothing more valuable than if you find a bug, make an issue. It takes like 5 minutes, and it really helps. Or like if there's something confusing, like put a discussion. I don't even know what these GitHub discussions are, but issues, regardless. Basically, yeah. Interact. Like the people on the other side of the GitHub repo love it when we do that. So don't be lazy and be like, I found a bug, close X, shut down the laptop, throw it out the window, like call it a day. It's
tempting sometimes, but
it's tempting.
So that's the GitHub. So
that's awesome. Well, firstly, thank you for sharing GeoPix. I think GeoPix is amazing. And let me say, as we're transitioning to UberGUI and talking about that, folks in the chat, if you do have kind of questions, if your mind goes from a fully melted state back into like a semi-solid state, by all means, put your questions in the chat. I know Lucas is doing like some really tremendous stuff, and if there's anything you guys want to know more about or kind of have questions about, I'm watching the chat. And now, see, Lucas, this is going to be so. Right now, just off of chat recommendations, Derivative has to hire you to do a new 3D viewport, and the HQ Pro is going to hire you to do a lighting workshop. So, we're set. You're good for a while, bro. You got
awesome
good now. Yeah,
sounds good. Yeah.
Sweet. So then, let's transition over to UberGUI, because this is, I don't want to jump and say like similarly polished, because I think obviously like GeoPix being a commercial product in UberGUI, because UberGUI wasn't a commercial product before, but it was like a still really polished tool.
It's incredibly polished, and I can explain why in a bit, but yeah.
And like super optimized, which is always like the craziest part of it. But would I be assuming that you made UberGUI because you were working on GeoPix, and you're like, I need a more optimized UI? Because now I'm thinking like I'm like, oh, that's why you built UberGUI.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, like, by all means, let's like open it up and take a look and see what's going on in here, because I want to take a look at some of, and maybe similar approach where for folks who've never seen it, because I know there's folks out there who like they've seen 2 pictures and they're like, yeah, UberGUI, I get it. Like, let's show them like a quick like, here's a UI, here's how it does a thing, and then we can dive into some of those behind the scenes elements of it.
Yeah, let me find. Let me open that separately so it's a little less stuff going on visually here. But I do have that in its own repo as well. All right, I'll just minimize this for now. Yeah, so UberGUI was, like you said, born from necessity out of GeoPix's UI situation. And I give you a brief history of my attempts at UI and how they all went and how they all failed in one way or another. I think the first thing I did, which is what everyone does, is you just throw a bunch of panel comps together. And, that's okay, but it's
what I'm still doing, bro.
Well, I mean, sorry, panel comps are necessary. Like you always have to have panel comps. But the problem with panel comps that you run into in some situations is that when you need to delete and create them on the fly, you run into problems. And making them. Let me pull up a diagram because I think this will help.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And you had that kind of like optimization diagram. That'd be great.
Yeah, because it's a process for sure. Okay, so this is, I'm sure everyone's thought a lot about optimizing for the CPU and GPU, which is the top two, right? The red and the orange ones. You got 16.6 milliseconds per frame, and that's kind of your window if you're doing 60 FPS stuff.
But if you're like me and you like 1080p at 30 FPS.
Right, and 30 is perfectly, 33. Most softwares probably have a lower bar at that point. And honestly, that's fine for me too. I like to aim for 60, but 30 is like a more than reasonable place to land.
It's definitely the more professional like recommendation. Like everyone should be aiming for 60 these days because honestly, I have so few clients that are like, oh yeah, can we do 30? They're nothing. Yeah, everyone on 4K 60. That's the new thing.
That's the thing. Yeah, and so optimizing for these two are fairly straightforward because you have a great performance monitor. You can just check what things are running at, and you can figure out where the problem is, and you can kind of just attack that and chip away at it. But when you start creating and destroying user interfaces, that's when the other three come into play.
Yeah.
On one hand, if you're creating and destroying lots of textures, you got to load those into memory. There's a small hit there, or maybe a big hit if it's a big texture. CPU processing, static, I'll come back to that. Node creation is pretty obvious. If you're creating and deleting nodes, there is a cost to that. And
very heavy one, yeah.
Yeah, depending on what kind of nodes that you're creating and deleting, it gets big. But you might think that 15 or 20 nodes in a slider comp, that's a pretty reasonable budget. But if you're making a UI that's 20 or 30 rows high, and then don't forget about the ones that have multiple columns in each row, it gets heavy very fast. And this is the thing I kept trying to solve time and time again. I did everything from pre-caching and pre-building UIs for every conceivable object in GeoPix, which meant if I had 15 objects, I had 15 fully built UIs, and that made the toe size huge. And loading times was like 2 or 3 minutes, so that went out the window eventually.
And so hold on, for context for that one, because I think folks maybe have a little bit, because for most folks, I think they see vanilla UI made with like panel comps, they see widgets. And then they've seen some community efforts in between, if they haven't seen UberGUI yet. And I think actually, I can't remember if it was you or was it Peter Systrom, way back when, was starting to talk about these cached UIs.
That's probably Peter,
yeah. Is that what you're talking about there when we're talking about this kind of like pre-made, like basically you essentially render every visual variation, save it in some way into the TOE file itself?
That's so you're probably thinking of Peter, but that is something I spent a lot of time thinking about internally. I haven't posted much about it or whatever, but the CPU processing static is my way of describing that, which is a static thing is like you move a slider, but you're going to let go of that slider eventually, right? It's not a thing that's constantly running, and that's not really static, but that's just that's where my brain decided to call it. So those are things that it's acceptable for it to be heavy because it's not happening for more than a few moments, right? And as long as it's not so heavy, and it doesn't scale because you're never dragging more than one slider. Of course, if you're doing like MIDI mapped UI, that may not be true. That's another one, right? If you're doing stuff where like lots of sliders are going to be moving at the same time, it can get heavy fast if you have a 1 millisecond cook time per slider. So,
and that was your first iteration of the UI, was like trying to do that, and the result was, well, you can move one slider, and even though it's heavy.
Well, sort of, yeah. So the instancing, I think like the caching of actual textures, so you're moving a cache, that's actually very good. It's about as efficient as you can get. But the thing what I'm referencing here is actually regardless of what method you're using, especially if you're using just like a text top, right, to like render numbers or strings. You can't get away from text tops when it comes to field comps. This bugged me greatly because you could make everything else pretty easily. Even with GLSL, if you had to go that route, but other methods as well, where you could like render textures through like texture atlases and stuff like that. You could do fonts and stuff like that. But when it came to like dynamically typing and entering stuff, things broke down. And so so anyways, yeah, having that like ability to not drag your performance down a lot when you're moving a slider or moving a handful of sliders, especially, that was a problem. Node creation, deletion, no matter what, if you're like spawning your UI, you're creating even just the top level panel comp. If you have 50 rows, you're going to feel it a little bit. And then if you have stuff inside, that's the problem, right? Building a good UI kit, you want it to be general purpose. Making it general purpose means it's like widgets. You got lots of stuff going on inside. And widgets is pretty like trimmed down. There's a lot of Python in there, and that's great. But even then, you still get a hit if you're making a long UI. So all of those problems and all the different ways I've tried to slice this and kind of failed took me to an experiment that ended up in a really robust place, which is UberGUI. And it's polished because it's been in use for so long, and it's a very simple, like self-contained thing. And so that's why it's actually quite stable. But yeah, the way this works is there's no panel comps inside. It's actually a web render top, which is just basically rendering. Yeah, so this awesome. This is actually rendering a HTML file, which is being generated. Yeah, so we have the CSS.
That's very smart.
And the CSS is being fed from the custom parameters here. So we're actually passing this into like a dynamically generated CSS sheet, and this is being combined with an HTML, which is being dynamically generated. So if I click these buttons over here, just let you click on different faux objects.
Oh, I like that. Those are like stress test buttons.
Right, just different like examples.
Yeah, I like that.
So the everything object is just something I made that's got every single parameter type in TouchDesigner, so I could see how they work, make sure there are no issues. And so you have these sliders, you can move them, you can double click on something and type in a number. You can also type in math, so +2 +0.2.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah, so you can do things like that. Color pickers. Now the color picker is a auxiliary UI that's like a panel, just a traditional panel comp, but it's so light that it doesn't get replicated either, right? There's not a color picker per parameter. It's just, it gets positioned. Same with the menus. So it's kind of a hybrid approach in that sense. Is like anything that requires an additional piece to kind of help you set that value launches something else. But yeah, we have a render top. And when you move these sliders, you'll notice that nothing is actually changing here in Datland because that was pretty heavy. And what's actually happening is there's a JavaScript file here with some functions called update and some other things too that basically send JavaScript commands to the web render top that tells it to update certain hard-coded values. So unless you're doing something like you're selecting a new object where it has to regenerate the entire thing, the JavaScript can do things like move the slider position or change the number inside of here. And so that allows us to do more lightweight updates to the UI without the whole refresh happening.
That's genius.
And so, yeah, this has been, working pretty well. Once I put it on GitHub, some people started, pouring in some ideas, and I started improving it. Now it's got like touchscreen support as well. It's working pretty well. We're trying to do things with like expressions, but that's still a ways off. But yeah, this is lightweight, right? Because
and the whole thing, like to your point, like if you middle click on it, like it's
this is resting frame rate.
And is that still similar when it's active, like you were saying? Like it basically is roughly that in that range?
It's a bit more. Yeah, so this is actually going to show you kind of the answer to that question. When you're dragging a slider, it's significantly, if you were to look at it by itself, 2 milliseconds is a lot in a 16 millisecond system. But this is like it's not exponential. There's no edge case where this gets higher. So that's like a static adjustment that seemed acceptable to me, given the fact that when you select a new object, there's almost no frame drop at all. And you have a whole new set of parameters. And one of the reasons it can do that is because the Chromium thread that the web render top uses is literally on another thread. And that's the beauty of it, is it's cheating away. And Touch is not really a multi-threaded app, but
Yeah.
this allowed me to cheat and put some of that heavy lifting on another thread. So many people would build UIs where the UI was on another thread, and that's a great solution. And so I kind of borrowed from that, and I was like, how can I do that without having to manage different TouchDesigner threads and stuff like that? Of course, the Touch Engine comp, I don't know. That's probably going to change that as well.
Yeah, could be an option for it in the future as well. So the interesting thing, I guess, is now that in this kind of preset where everything is moving, that cook time, like you were saying, is still
at 1 millisecond.
Wow, so that's pretty crazy. Like that's amazing.
Yeah, and if I open up my task manager, can find that Chromium thread somewhere, CEF TD minion.
Yeah,
it's doing some work, but it's not on this thread, and so that actually makes multi-threaded systems a little more valuable again as having UIs. And there's several of these in GeoPix. There's one for every window, but they shut down when you're not viewing it. So I've used them for the outliner as well. I haven't published that yet. I'd like to, but the outliner is a web render driven thing as well, and there's some other stuff too. So yeah.
And there's a question in the chat. Can you drag and drop native nodes and pars into it? Or how does that process work for, like, if you were going to make a UI yourself, I guess is a similar question.
Oh, in terms of like loading. Oh yeah. So when you click these buttons, it's running I think this is, let me know if I'm misinterpreting the question, but it's basically taking just the source op, which is what actually generates this, and the destination ops, which is a list of all the operators you want to try to set those settings to when you change something. And they're just running a function, an extension function that says launch source destination. It's super simple. So you run that every time your selection changes, and it will populate based on certain rules for pages. So you can have custom pages only, uppercase page names, or you can specify things in different ways. So,
and then if you were going to like make a page, actually, let me see. Dropping the amazing robot and son is saying, I mean dropping into the web top and capture and respond to that.
Oh, you mean like if you have an operator parameter and you want to plug an operator into that slot?
I think so. Is that right, Amazing Robot and Sons? Let us know if we're getting their question in right. Yep, they say yep.
Yeah, that's currently a feature that's in active development. It's not quite ready yet, but yeah, it's been asked for, and that's hopefully something that can get out there soon. There is some drag and dropping, but it's very limited at the moment.
Yeah. And then how would you go about, like, so if somebody had just dropped an Uber GUI, like how would you make your own user interface in it? Like, what's that process look like for them?
What do you mean exactly?
Like, let's say if you wanted to make your own like control panel for something. From scratch, yeah.
So yeah, I could just make a base, and let's say I have options as a page name, and then some slider, and then maybe an RGB picker, my color, and I could configure these. These settings actually do influence what Uber GUI lets you do in terms of the ranges and stuff like that. And I could just manually, you don't have to launch it with Python. You could just go over here and type this into inputs and outputs, and there you go. You've got your it's.
That's pretty hype. Yeah, that's like, it doesn't get much easier. It doesn't get much easier than that, I don't think.
No, and so yeah, once you start moving these sliders, you can see that you're updating it in both places. It's not using binding because there's not like a web top bind option, but it's the same in functionality. You're basically tweaking it in one place, and this allows you to do interesting things with like multi-input systems where you're trying to also drive things from OSC, but you want to have that control as well with the mouse and keyboard. Yeah,
that's really nice, because I always find, like, in my workflows, I'm leaning towards this way of, like, if something needs a change or a fiddling, it happens on a custom parameter. Like, no one's reaching around like touching it. Like, it's a custom parameter, it's got settings on it. So knowing that it's just like basically drag and drop, and I have a full UI out of it is pretty amazing.
Yeah, and GeoPix, there's so much UI requirements in there that I really wanted to lock it down to a specific workflow. And custom parameters had so much functionality. There's only a few small edge cases that they didn't quite do what I had hoped that they would do, but for the most part they would. And so I was like, well, why don't I just make a consistent UI that wraps around this? Because over time, workflows change minutely, and things you do 2 weeks ago are like a little bit different than today, and it can get to be messy if you have different iterations of a tool scattered throughout your network. So I locked this down, and I made it like extremely like consistent. And in the end, this solved the CPU processing real-time GPU. It's on a different thread. The memory was pretty minimal because it's just one render top.
Yeah, it's just one. You don't
scattering a bunch of render tops.
The concept of different UI elements doesn't even exist here technically, right?
Yeah, and there's so much cool stuff built into HTML. Why reinvent the wheel? That's something I learned painfully. Is don't reinvent it if you can find a way to bend something into a square peg in a round hole. If the square peg has all these features, it's maybe worth doing. So
just gotta find a square hole.
Yeah.
It
doesn't always exist.
Yeah, we have a bunch of questions for the chat, and I would say even before I get to the question in the chat, I'm coming to you folks right now. But this idea is something that you've probably heard a lot of people talk about, which is, and I think Richard Burns does this with text formatting. I think Richard's talked about, and I think Richard has a tool where it's okay, well, you can style your text in HTML and it comes out the web render, and then you kind of put that in there. Because sometimes working with text top, if you get somebody who's really sitting there in Illustrator and Photoshop and doing these fancy designs, you're text top, this is gonna be a tricky one.
Yeah.
But I think this is easily the best example I've seen from the UI aspect, because I know even on our blog I've talked about, if you're doing some complicated stuff, why reinvent the wheel when the web world has so much rich frameworks, libraries, toolkits for this kind of thing. And this is also free and open source. Folks can grab Uber GUI. So we'll talk about the links in a second. Let me get to some of these questions because we got some good ones.
Yeah.
And first we got more compliments. James Lee Hunter saying that Lucas is not only a talented dev but a fantastic communicator. Not just lights creating a bright future for this dude. I agree.
Appreciate it.
And then Alpha Moonbase was asking, are you using a web server to distribute the file? And if so, is it possible to display the UI in a separate browser window? I think you're not. No, because you're feeding it straight into the web render. But hypothetically, it's only a few more. It's a hop skip away to then just take that HTML and CSS, feed it in a web server.
Yeah, with some modification, maybe. I forgot to mention one thing that will, I think, also partially illuminate how what he's talking about is working. So when you mouse over stuff inside, so I took a lot of inspiration from the render pick chop, where you mouse over stuff and you get information back. One of the challenges with Uber GUI is it's happening on a thread, so same frame information delivery is not always guaranteed. You might have it on the next frame, so you really have to use the logic from the render pick as much as possible. And so, we have this comma separated structure here that, it's basically telling me where my mouse is, what parameter I'm hovering over. And so this allows me when
does it show you the values in there too?
It does. And this is totally like a hack. This information is what's actually being used to update the custom parameters when I move the slider, because otherwise I have no way of knowing which HTML element I'm hovering over. So this is a JavaScript thing that's being executed every frame inside of this script. And it's basically spitting out crucial information to the title tag, which is, again, a hack. A better solution would have been to use the, some of the WebSocket stuff. I haven't messed with it. But it was a hack, but it worked. And it's pretty simple. And then there's no extra moving parts I had to worry about. So it stuck. I kept it around. But this is how things are getting back out of web render top world and back into TouchDesigner world. And so converting it to that would probably require adopting some of those other nodes, those DATs, to do
or
communication.
Like you're saying, setting up a WebSocket connection between the two.
Right. Yeah.
But it's definitely a great place to start if someone is interested in that kind of thing, for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
So we got another question here from James Lee Hunter saying, do you think the crazy amount of TD optimization Lucas does will and should be necessary in the future? Why are stock options so inefficient?
Wire stock. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess that's a good question. I'd be curious to get your opinion, but I could say fairly my light died. Aw. Okay. Well, I was gonna say from my side of things, I think it's, and I always bring up widgets and panel components as the great example of these things. It's not that they're inefficient, because I think, like you were saying earlier, TouchDesigner is crazy efficient. The problem is that it's also crazy open-ended, and it's very easy for users to make things that are inefficient. And I think that creates this perception that so much things in Touch are inefficient by default. When actually, when you look at all the nodes that you can throw down in there, all the kinds of work you can do, it's actually insanely efficient. And I always use that example of widgets and native panel components as that example of in TouchDesigner, sometimes it's not. You almost have to read between the lines a little bit, I think, to figure out what's a good use case for this specific tool. And I think Widgets does a good example of that, because I always say, because in the HQ Pro we have a course for both. If you needed to make custom panel components from scratch, like this course, if you want to use widgets, you need quick and dirty, like this course, because they really are two different things. And with widgets, you get the trade-off of so much more features, functionality, aesthetics, styling built in, but heavier. Whereas panel comps, some assembly required, go buy your own batteries, build a UI, but it's going to be so much more efficient. So I guess that's kind of my thought process on it. Like I'm always of the mind that whatever we can make beginner friendly usually is like a net positive for everybody. So I'm always thinking about like, oh, well, how can I explain the concept of optimization to newer folks? Because it's not this big, insane, impossible thing for folks. It just takes a little bit of like thoughtfulness about what's going on in the system, a couple little tricks you learn here and there, and most people can start optimizing from that. So I think that's I know it's a roundabout answer, but that's kind of my take on it. Like, do you have a similar or different opinion on that?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think something I'd add is that TouchDesigner is really built for doing real-time things in a isolated way. And I say isolated, what I mean by that is like every node, if you think about tops are the easiest to talk about this in, is like you have a text top and an edge top. It's an effect that you do on the previous thing. And that's the beauty of Touch. That's how everything in Touch is built. But the caveat of that is that sometimes you run into performance issues because those two functions are happening separately, when really you would have a better performance by putting those text and edge features into one shader, right? Which that's what tops are shaders. And so it's a trade-off. You get like you said, it's easier, it's more beginner friendly. You can wrap your head around it, and that's so important, because so many people would just not be into this kind of stuff if they didn't have something that I think was a little more approachable. Because that's definitely how it worked for me. I was like, this stuff makes sense to me. I'm a visual artist. I see visual things, and I can like go in there and fiddle with sliders. And when it comes to UI, it's like an exponential problem of that same thing, where you're like dealing with individual components. And that's really easy to build and work with, but the downside is that there's a lot of things happening in ways that are maybe not as efficient. So, and
I think even another good parallel, like other than just widgets versus panel components, is open frameworks and Cinder and these kind of things versus TouchDesigner, right? Like there's, if somebody whose their whole objective was maximum efficiency, maybe they're going to turn to just a C++ framework where they can only include the very specific elements they need in the exact order, most efficiency. But to your point, I think for most people, whatever, and listen, I'm a grumbler. I'm a serial grumbler. I'm grumbling all the time. I'm always, why is it 1 millisecond is too damn long? Like that meme. Like that's me. But I still understand that my trade-off is, well, I could pay the 0.5 millisecond, 1 millisecond or something for here, or I literally have to code C++ or shaders myself. And a lot of the time it's like, no way, this is way better. To make it 2 milliseconds, we're chilling. Like, as long as I don't have to go like code things myself, like this is great. Yeah. So I think it just becomes, and I think what you're reinforcing is it's like a thought process, and more just knowing what tools you are and the advantages, the trade-offs that you make for some of those tools.
Yeah, and I think one last little thing there to add is, when you do UI and I think more traditional software settings, and I honestly don't have a lot of experience with this, but think frameworks like Angular and stuff like that do like UIs, people just like adopt those and they use them, and you can do your job with that. And that's cool. I think the advantage to struggling through some of this stuff in Touch or anywhere really that has kind of the same situations is that you learn a lot of the reasons of why it's not performing well, and that stuff translates to other things as well. It's not just UI. And so that kind of having to constantly reassess how I was building UI really helped me think about some of the other stuff I was doing in Touch differently, and that all just kind of rolls in together in some ways, and I think that's valuable too.
Yeah. So we have another question. James Lee Hunter's hopping off on the questions. Thank you, my friend, for your questions.
Nice.
And I think this one is one that I think we're going to have different opinions on, which is that, isn't it scary putting so much effort into tools that can be broken with TD updates? Especially because TD is it's a fast moving software. And, you know, the derivative's always working hard to bring new features, update stuff, and makes the base a little bit more shaky for certain types of things. And I'll, you know, say that, is it scary? It's terrifying, absolutely terrifying. It's one of the worst feelings, I think, is the fear of, do I update now or not this build?
Yeah.
And I would say that's probably one of the big reasons why, you know, HQ Pro, like I said, has a bunch of tools, and before that we had like our tool shop. But it's been one of the reasons why I've always kept my tools very focused and not really gone down the road of working on things like GeoPix or things like... I mean, UberGUI is a bit in the middle, like it's much higher level than like some of our tools, but, you know, I think GeoPix is like a full user experience that's like really beautiful and well built. It's, you know, this exact reason is one of the things that I've been like, you know what, like for me, because I have so much other stuff going on, like that's just an extra stress. And I'm like, you know what, like I'm not a big tooling guy anymore. Like, do you feel, but you seem to have found a way to balance it and manage it, and maybe workflows that help you through that?
I kind of agree. It's scary to upgrade. 2021 upgrade was like, oh, here we go. I got to do this. There's just so much cool stuff here. But and like when I first opened GeoPix in 2021, whatever branch I was on at that exact moment, now it's 12380. I just remember like looking at it, I was like, what?
Really,
what is going on?
Did
Nothing
really, like...
is working. But what I discovered, what I discovered was that like 80% of the problems were like instances of the same problem. And so once you track a couple down, it goes much quicker than you think. And a lot of it has to do with, I'll say a lot of things happen where I'm using some really obnoxious expression in a parameter because it doesn't involve nodes. And that was helpful for some form of optimization. But some of those obnoxious expressions don't work well after updates. Like really simple ones work, but the kind of marking parameters as dirty and things that normally work in one feature or version don't, you know, translate to the next one sometimes. And that's a lot of it. I'm trying to think of what some of the other main ones are, but that's a big one. Surprisingly, it's just like things that don't cook right. They cooked in one version and it was kind of a hack, and maybe I shouldn't have done it that way. They don't cook in the next version. So I think sometimes that's just an indication that maybe use a little bit more of a, if you can afford to, use a simpler node-based approach, and put things in nodes, because that's the stuff that I think gets, you know, tested more thoroughly by, you know, derivative as they put things out. It's obviously what TouchDesigner is built of, is nodes. So things that are more invisible, I think, can sometimes run into more issues. So
yeah, and that's interesting because I feel, I don't know if you've had this experience, I feel like the base is stabling, or at least has been more stable recently. Like even the jump from 20 to 21, I didn't like. I've even had projects that have gone over the hump, and I was terrified because it was an accidental save. You know what I'm talking about? Like because you know when you have too many builds on the computer, and you just weren't thinking, and you open the project in the newer build, and then you saved, and you're like, oh my god, what have I done? You know. And like, you know, the Job meme, like, I've made a terrible mistake. But then to my surprise, like most of the things worked fine. And like, to your point, like, oh, okay, well, like a little thing changed, or, oh, you know, this thing cooks a tiny bit different now. So I will say, like, in my mind now, it feels a lot better than I used to be. I feel like 5 years ago, 6 years ago, like updates could really like gut whatever you were working on. Like, have you had that same feeling?
Definitely. Every time I update, it's not as bad as I think it's going to be. And that's for something as big as GeoPix. I expect it to be a total, like, just shutdown, essentially. So, I mean, in the past, I've had updates where, like, it won't even open, it just insta crashes. And that kind of stuff doesn't really happen much anymore, and that's great. One thing I will say about the multiple builds, just a quick, it's a trick I started using recently, because I have that problem. I'll double click on it and I go about my day and start saving, and it's like, oh crap, I'm 15 saves into a new build, and that's not what I meant to do. Is I'll set the default to the lowest version I have on the computer. That way, anytime I open it, a newer build, smart. It's like, hey, it tells you, hey, error. Right, it gives you the error, and you can be like, oh yeah, I'm not supposed to be using this version. So that way it keeps you from upgrading the version, and it warns you if you're potentially downgrading it. So
that's a smart move. So listen, folks, those are pro tricks right here. You know, this is the stuff that doesn't make it into fancy YouTube videos, but this is the stuff that like keeps your sanity on the day to day.
That's a sanity one for sure.
So for folks that do want to get a hold of UberGUI, I imagine this is on your GitHub as well, but do you want to throw a link and we can put it in the chat?
Yeah, I'll definitely just pull it up here and also go through it. But yeah, the Environmental Design GitHub. You can just go to the repositories, Uber
And
GUI.
I'll throw this in the chat for everybody.
Yeah, github.com/environmentaldesign/Uber GUI. And yeah, however you want to download it, the code's fine. This is, something that's, when I have time, I'm pretty active on this and GeoPix. It's just kind of something I have to do on the side of other work and whatnot. But it is something that, lots of people have been chiming in, and we've been making lots of progress. And yeah, if you have any thoughts, throw them in there.
It's amazing, bro. Like, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I always say this thing where, and for folks in the chat, let me tell you, this is like we're gonna have like a heart to heart. That came out sounding really bad. But I meant that we were supposed to have I was gonna say a heart on heart, but I was like, what is going on in my mouth? But okay, anyways, we're gonna have a heart to heart. There's a lot of folks in the community that do really cool stuff, and they do it out of their own spare time, and nothing makes them happier than active consumers. Because there's so many folks that are just gonna hit download, close the window, and like never talk to Lucas. Either read a blog post. You never. It's passive consumption is something that makes it really hard for folks to stay motivated to do things.
That's
and
true. Yeah.
If you start to get into some of these tools, you're looking at Uber GUI, you're looking at GeoPix, or anyone's kind of work that they're putting out there, and you're like, this is cool. Don't. It sounds so silly. It's just like, just send them an email and say, really cool tool, thanks. Like, it's so silly, but it really can mean a lot for folks that are working on stuff. So I highly urge everyone who's going to kind of take a look at Uber GUI, who's going to take a look at GeoPix, challenge yourself to be active, as a consumer, not just passive. If you find bugs, issues, put them on GitHub. Send some congrats and love to Lucas for all his hard work and kind of like releasing these tools for free. All that stuff. I know it sounds kind of whatever, but you got to trust your boy on this one. That is important. So with that said, I'm going to go back to our side by side to go back all the way to Aristotle's question.
Cool.
from way back in the beginning of the stream, which is a little bit talking about, what excites you now, and what are some of the things that looking to the future you're thinking, this is really what I want to tackle. Like, this is kind of like the stuff that's like, I wake up in the morning like thinking about, yeah, I want that.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's definitely,
and you can't say money because that's mine.
Well, that's always a part of it, but that's honestly, like, if I'm to narrow it down to a specific topic of interest in, like, all of the realms that I've covered from, like, when I started things right after switching to kind of TouchDesigner world to now, I would say that my interests have funneled significantly, a lot into like the software realm and like being software developer. I say that now as not just a TouchDesigner user. I mean, I think that's something we should all say, because we are developers. You think like a developer, even if you're not coding things, 100%. And you end up getting into Python like instantly if you're using Touch. It's just it's inevitable. So
you have to.
Yeah, I would say that the things that interest me the most are GPU effects, and also just like creating software itself is really fun. I enjoy making a polished thing that you can use with the UI. I think that's really rewarding to take something super cool. And part of it's like just a matter of selling something visually, because in the age of social media, if you're creating something really cool, it's like code, and you have like just a thumbnail of like some nodes in like the network, it might do something really cool and nobody's going to really think that much about it. It's unfortunate. It's just a reality. Like, you got to like put something together that's going to really attract people. And I think that's part of it. That's not the primary reason, but that's an aspect as well, as building the UI so that people are interested. But I would say that software, but the thing I really care about, if I were to pick one super nerdy deep topic, it's creating real-time effects and making a real-time rendering engine that's in Touch that much better, right? Screen space reflection is an example of something I want to get into. There's global illumination, real-time techniques that are also screen space, just various things like that there's like papers out in the world, and you can see like some people's attempts, and there's like stuff you can dig through on GitHub that other people have done. And I love learning from that stuff, and I love implementing it in TouchDesigner specifically, because I feel like a lot of people are hitting up Unreal and Unity, and those are great platforms, but I want to see some of this stuff in Touch. I think that would be amazing.
Amen.
And so that's something that I like dream about. I'm like, I'd love to just be able to do that, but that's a random kind of sub-focus thing. Generally, though, I enjoy building software. I enjoy building tools that do stuff, whether it be a small tool, big tool. Things that interact with lighting is obviously a big one. I've been doing that for almost a decade now. But yeah, it's all over the place. I mean, I enjoy challenges that are just hard to solve. That's just stuff I find interesting. It's like if it's easy to do, I don't really go towards it. If it's something that seems mystifying, I'm just attracted to that stuff. I don't know why. That's just how my brain works. So.
Well, I was gonna say, after tackling the like clustered lighting, you must feel like, oh yeah, like all this other GI, like screen space reflect, easy. Like this is it. I'm gonna jump in. Like I did that other one. That one was these ones is, you know, we can run it back now. We can. Well,
I'll be real too about it. Like it's not like I read that paper and I understood the maths behind every single thing. Like a lot of it, you go to Stack Overflow is a good example. We talked about this last time. You go to Stack Overflow and you find a solution. You don't necessarily know how every single character works, but you know that it does work. But then eventually you do start to understand some of how it works. And when it comes to something like clustered shading, I did have to like understand the high level pretty well to implement it. Even if I didn't understand some of the functions, there's one function I haven't been able to fully dissect that is preventing me from doing lighting in orthographic mode. Still silly little detail that I can't crack the code. It's just too I don't know how to reverse engineer this function to extrapolate it into orthographic. But that's just an example, right? There's stuff like that you know, maybe I'll figure it out a year from now. I don't know. But it's a process.
Well, thanks for joining us, my friend. It's been a pleasure. We're kind of at the end of our time here. For folks that want to learn more about your work, want to connect with you, what's the best way they can do that? You know, we put the links for I'm putting all the links now, but you throw more links. You just give me links. Anyone who wants to hit you up.
Cool. Well, first of all, thanks for having me too. This has been really fun, and it's been interesting hearing your perspective, and honestly, everyone else's who's commented in the chat. I would say if you want to get in touch, the best way, I'll pull it up again, although you don't really need to.
I'm putting out.
Check it out.
I'm firing links. It's like a machine gun. Facebook is going up here.
Geopix
IG is going up here. YouTube. I'm doing it all, bro.
Oh man, yeah. So geopix.io, again, that's just like an easy to remember web link. It's got all the stuff built into it. So that's just the easy one to go to. But my email is on there as well. Like you said, the Facebook, all the tutorials that you'll find, and if you are curious to go dig through my ancient past of shenanigans, I only highlighted a few things. That's all on the YouTube as well. But
that's awesome. Did you post a lot of those on YouTube?
Yeah, there's quite a bit of updates on there. And if you go back far enough, it just gets a totally different area, some app stuff, and then go back far enough, it's the 3D world. But so that's where I'd go. Just geopix.io, and everything you need is there.
Awesome. Well, for folks that are, just to wrap up our situation here, our show, I'm Elburz. I should have done these intros like right at the beginning. I'm like, literally, no, people might not even know who this bald man is on the screen.
Oh, yeah.
But we run the Interactive Immersive HQ. If you're interested in kind of really learning TouchDesigner, making it your profession, getting it into the industry, we really believe we've got kind of the most comprehensive resource out there that covers training, support in our kind of private Facebook group where myself, Matthew Reagan, and kind of like all of our other fantastic teachers are in there helping you folks get in there. Got over 70 or 80 hours of workshop materials. We got twice a month group sessions where we're all talking like together on a Zoom call about what you're working on and how to get through struggles. So if you're really interested in this kind of thing, I'm going to put a link in the chat. It's got a 7-day free trial, no obligation. So you can literally just go in there and just rock and pop off for 7 days, see how it feels. And if you'd like to stick around, we're happy to have you. So let me put that link in the chat for y'all. Which is one of those things I really should had the link ready, but I'm like copying it. Don't worry, it's coming. It's coming, folks. So with that said, thanks everybody in the chat. It's a lot of fun to take some of those questions. I know folks are excited to see Lucas. Lucas, again, thank you, my friend, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And for everyone else here, you know what that schedule thing is like. We do it on the second Friday of the month. Even if the Friday the 1st, that counts as the first one. You know what I'm talking about? So you second Friday, you know where to be at. And if you do want a recording of this, so Twitch holds recordings for 60 days on their VOD section, so you can pop it off there. YouTube is going to be on there permanently. Sometimes it doesn't appear on the homepage of our channel, so just make sure you go to the videos section, and I think you switch it over to live recordings, or maybe they're just in the list. We're getting outside my pay grade here. So with that said, thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll see you on the next one.
Yep.